Every morning at precisely 7:30 a.m., the sound of clip-clopping hooves echoed down Main Street in Millbrook, Tennessee, announcing the arrival of the town's most reliable source of entertainment. Chester Abernathy, 74 years old and stubborn, as the day was long, rode his ancient mule, Bertha, through the center of town like a relic from a bygone era that had somehow forgotten to disappear. The sight never failed to draw snickers from the coffee shop crowd at Murphy's Diner, where the local businessmen gathered each morning to solve the world's problems over eggs and bacon. Chester sat ramrod straight in Bertha's worn saddle, his weathered cowboy hat pulled low over eyes that had seen 7 decades of living, his clothes clean but patched in a dozen places. Bertha herself was a magnificent creature in her own way, 32 years old, gray round the muzzle, with an attitude that suggested she found the whole human race slightly beneath her notice. "There goes crazy Chester again," chuckled Bob Hendricks, the town's mayor and owner of the largest car dealership in 3 counties. "Someone ought to tell him this ain't 1890. That mule's older than my grandmother was when she died," added Jim Morrison, the bank president, stirring sugar into his coffee. "It's a miracle they both don't just keel over in the middle of the street." The laughter that followed was comfortable and familiar, the kind that small towns use to define themselves. By what they're not, they weren't backward people riding mules to town. They were modern, progressive, connected to the 21st century by their pickup trucks and SUVs and the cell phone towers that had sprouted like metal trees around the county. But if the men at Murphy's Diner could have seen inside Chester's saddlebags that morning, their comfortable assumptions might have been shaken. Hidden beneath an old rain poncho were architectural drawings, carefully hand-sketched and annotated, in Chester's neat handwriting, plans for a building that would house 8 children, complete with bedrooms, a kitchen, a common area, and all the infrastructure necessary to create a real home. Chester had been working on those plans for 6 months, ever since the day he'd learned that the Millbrook Children's Home was closing due to state budget cuts. 8 children, ranging in age from 6 to 15, were going to be scattered across the region to different foster homes and institutions. The state had tried to keep them together, but no single facility had room for all 8, and no foster family was prepared to take on such a large group. "It's unfortunate," the social worker had explained to the small crowd gathered at the town meeting, where the closure was announced, "but these children will receive excellent care in their new placements. Sometimes separation is necessary for the greater good." Chester had sat in the back of that meeting, listening to the bureaucratic language that turned 8 children into a logistical problem to be solved efficiently, rather than a family to be kept together. He'd watch the other attendees nod sagely and accept the inevitable with the resignation of people who'd learned not to fight battles they couldn't win. But Chester Abernathy had never learned that particular lesson. After the meeting, he'd ridden Bertha home to his small cabin on the outskirts of town and spent the night thinking about those 8 children. He'd never married, never had children of his own, but he understood something about being alone in the world. His parents had died when he was 17, leaving him with 40 acres of rocky Tennessee hill country and a determination to make something of himself that didn't require anyone else's approval. For 57 years, Chester had lived simply and independently. He grew most of his own food, raised a few chickens and goats, and made a modest living crafting custom furniture from the hardwood trees on his property. He'd built his cabin himself, along with every barn, shed, and outbuilding on his land. He knew construction, he knew land management, and he knew how to make a dollar stretch further than most people thought possible. Most importantly, he knew that 8 children shouldn't be separated just because it was administratively convenient. The idea had come to him in the middle of that sleepless night, crazy and impractical and absolutely right. He would build a home for those children himself, on his own land, with his own hands, using every skill he'd developed over a lifetime of self-reliance. Now, 6 months later, Chester guided Bertha through the morning ritual of town ridicule, toward the building supply store at the far end of Main Street. Today he was buying the lumber for the foundation, the first visible step in a project that would either prove him a visionary or confirm the town's assessment of him as a harmless old fool. Morning, Chester called out Eddie Packer, who managed the lumber yard and was one of the few people in town who treated Chester with genuine respect. "What can I do for you today?" Chester dismounted from Bertha with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his age. "Need to place an order for foundation lumber, Eddie. Good quality stuff, nothing cheap." Eddie pulled out his order pad, used to Chester's occasional purchases of small quantities of wood for his furniture projects. "How much you thinking?" Chester handed over a carefully written list that made Eddie's eyebrows rise toward his hairline. "This is for a foundation. Chester, this is enough lumber for a house." "That's right. A big house. What are you building out there?" Chester looked around the lumber yard, noting the curious stares of other customers who'd overheard the conversation. In a town the size of Millbrook, interesting news traveled faster than gossip, and both traveled at the speed of light. "Building a home for some children who need one." Eddie studied the list, again his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Chester, I got to ask, you got the permits for something this size?" "The county's real strict about building codes, especially for anything involving children. Working on it. And the money, this order alone is going to run you close to $15,000. Chester reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a bank envelope. "Cash okay?" Eddie stared at the envelope, then at Chester, then at the list again. In 30 years of running the lumber yard, he'd rarely seen anyone pay cash for an order this large, especially not a man who rode a mule to town and was generally considered the local eccentric. "Chester, I don't mean to pry, but are you sure about this? Building a house is a big project, especially for someone your age." Chester smiled, the first genuine smile anyone in town had seen from him in years. "Eddie, I've been building things since before you were born. Age doesn't make your hands forget how to use tools, but the scale of this project will take as long as it takes. Bertha and I aren't in any hurry." As if summoned by her name, Bertha wandered over and nuzzled Chester's shoulder with the affection of a creature who'd spent 3 decades as someone's most trusted companion. Eddie made the decision that would make him the first person in Millbrook to bet on Chester Abernathy's impossible dream. "All right, Chester, when do you want this delivered?" "Tomorrow, if you can manage it. I'll have it out to your place by noon." Chester mounted Bertha again, tipped his hat to Eddie, and guided his mule back toward Main Street. Behind him, he could hear Eddie already on the phone, probably calling his wife to tell her about the crazy order the old man had just placed. By evening, the news would be all over town. By tomorrow, half of Millbrook would find an excuse to drive past Chester's property to see what the old fool was up to now. Chester didn't mind. He'd been the subject of town speculation for most of his adult life, and it had never changed his plans before. But as he rode Bertha home through the afternoon sunshine, he found himself hoping that someday soon, the town's laughter would turn to something else. Something like respect. The first spectators arrived before the lumber truck did. Chester was out behind his cabin, using an old-fashioned transit level to mark the corners of his foundation, when he heard the car engines on the county road. By 10 o'clock, a small crowd had gathered at the fence line that separated his property from the road, watching him work with the fascination usually reserved for circus acts or train wrecks. "What do you think he's really building?" asked Martha Hendricks, the mayor's wife, who'd driven out with 2 friends from her garden club. "Probably another one of his workshops," replied Susan Morrison, the banker's wife. "You know how these old bachelors get. They start projects they can't finish." "My husband says he ordered enough lumber to build a mansion," added Carol Peterson, whose husband worked at the lumber yard. "But look at him out there with that old surveying equipment. He looks like he's playing pioneer." Chester could hear their voices carrying across the pasture, but he continued his methodical work. The foundation had to be perfect square level and properly sized for the building that would rise above it. He'd done the calculations a dozen times, checking and rechecking every measurement against the plans he'd drawn. When the lumber truck arrived at noon, followed by Eddie Packer in his pickup, The crowd at the fence had grown to include several teenagers on bicycles and old Tom Bradley, who'd walked over from his neighboring farm to see what the commotion was about. "Where do you want this, Chester?" Eddie called out, gesturing to the massive load of treated lumber on his flatbed. Chester pointed to a level area near where he'd been working. "Stack it there, nice and neat. We'll want to keep it off the ground and covered." Eddie began unloading the lumber with practiced efficiency, but Chester could see him glancing occasionally toward the fence line and the growing crowd of onlookers in a small town. Public skepticism was a powerful force, and Eddie was clearly wondering if he'd made a mistake by taking Chester's money. "This is a lot of lumber for one man to handle," Eddie said as they stacked the heavy beams. "You thought about hiring some help?" "Don't need help. Bertha and I can manage." As if to prove his point, Chester led Bertha over to the lumber pile and began rigging a simple pulley system that would allow the mule to help move the heavier pieces. It was an elegant solution that spoke to decades of experience working alone and making do with what was available. The crowd watched this demonstration with a mixture of amusement and amazement. Bertha responded to Chester's commands with the precision of a well-trained work animal, backing up and moving forward in perfect coordination with her owner's needs. "I'll be damned," muttered Tom Bradley. "That old mule's smarter than half the people in this county." By the end of the week, Chester had framed and poured the foundation. He worked methodically, starting before dawn and continuing until the light failed, taking breaks only when Bertha needed rest or food. The foundation was substantial, much larger than anything Chester had built before, and its professional quality surprised even his skeptics. "Maybe he really is building a house," admitted Bob Hendricks during the morning coffee gathering at Murphy's Diner. "That foundation looks solid enough to hold up a barn. But what's he going to do with a house that big?" wondered Jim Morrison. "He's lived in that little cabin for 50 years. Why would he need more space now?" The question everyone was asking got its answer the following Monday, when Chester rode Bertha into town and stopped at the county courthouse. He hitched his mule to the bike rack which drew its usual collection of stairs and walked into the building with a folder full of paperwork. "I need to apply for a permit," he told Rebecca Martinez, the county clerk who handled building applications. Rebecca looked up from her computer screen, recognized Chester, and prepared for one of their occasional interactions. Chester didn't come to town often, but when he did need something from the county, he was always meticulously prepared and absolutely polite. "What kind of permit, Mr. Abernathy?" Chester placed his folder on the counter. "Residential construction. Single-family dwelling designed to house 8 children." Rebecca blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, did you say 8 children? That's right. I'm building a home for the children from the Millbrook Children's Home that's closing." Rebecca opened the folder and found herself looking at detailed architectural plans, complete with electrical layouts, plumbing diagrams, and structural specifications. They weren't the rough sketches she might have expected from a do-it-yourself builder. They were professional quality plans that had obviously been drawn by someone who understood both construction and the specific requirements for housing children. "Mr. Abernathy, these are very detailed plans. Did you have professional help with these?" "No, ma'am, I drew them myself." Rebecca studied the plans more carefully, noting the careful attention to safety features, the efficient use of space, and the thoughtful details that would make the building not just functional, but comfortable for children. "This is quite an undertaking for one person. Are you working with any social service agencies? Have you spoken with the state about becoming a licensed care provider?" Chester pulled another folder from his stack. "All the paperwork's in there. I've been in touch with the Department of Children's Services for 3 months. They're willing to work with me if I can provide a suitable facility and meet all their requirements." Rebecca spent the next hour reviewing Chester's application, growing more impressed with each page. He'd thought of everything: fire safety, accessibility requirements, proper ratios of bathroom facilities to bedrooms, even specifications for a commercial-grade kitchen that could handle cooking for 10 people. "Mr. Abernathy, I have to ask, do you have experience with childcare? This is a significant responsibility." Chester was quiet for a moment, looking out the window toward where Bertha waited patiently in the courthouse parking lot. No, ma'am, I don't have experience with children. But I have experience with being alone when you shouldn't have to be. And I have experience building things that last. The state requires background checks, training programs, regular inspections. I know. I've completed the background checks and enrolled in the training. The inspections will have to wait until the building's finished, but I'm designing everything to exceed their standards. Rebecca looked at the earnest face of the man the town considered a harmless eccentric and realized she was looking at someone who'd spent months planning a project that would change 8 children's lives forever. I'll need to review these plans with the county engineer, but preliminarily, everything looks in order. The permit fee will be $800. Chester counted out the money in cash, just as he had at the lumber yard. Mr. Abernathy, can I ask you something personal? Sure. Why are you doing this? You could live comfortably in your cabin for the rest of your life without taking on such a massive responsibility. Chester collected his paperwork and prepared to leave. Ma'am, I've lived 74 years mostly thinking about myself. Seemed like it might be time to try thinking about someone else for a while. By the time Chester emerged from the courthouse, word of his permit application had already reached Murphy's Diner through the county's informal communication network. The morning coffee crowd was buzzing with speculation and disbelief. He's really going to try to build a children's home, reported Sally Peterson, who had a friend who worked in the courthouse. The clerk said his plans looked professional. That crazy old man thinks he can take care of 8 children. Bob Hendricks shook his head. He can barely take care of himself. Maybe we should do something, suggested Jim Morrison. Talk to the state, express some concerns about the welfare of those children. But old Doc Williams, who'd been quietly eating his breakfast in the corner booth, looked up from his eggs and bacon with a thoughtful expression. You know, he said slowly, I've been watching Chester Abernathy for 30 years. He's never started a project he didn't finish, and he's never made a promise he didn't keep. Maybe instead of trying to stop him, we should be asking ourselves why none of the rest of us thought to help those children. The diner fell quiet as the men considered this uncomfortable question. Outside, Chester mounted Bertha and rode slowly home, unaware that he'd just planted the first seeds of doubt in the minds of people who'd been so certain, and they knew who he was and what he was capable of. By midsummer, the skeptics were running out of jokes. Chester's house, because that's what it clearly was now, rose from its foundation, with the steady inevitability of a plant growing toward sunlight. Week by week, the frame took shape, revealing the scale and ambition of his project. It wasn't just big, it was thoughtfully designed, with wide hallways, large windows, and a wraparound porch that suggested someone who understood how children needed space to play and grow. The morning coffee crowd at Murphy's Diner had shifted from ridicule to grudging curiosity, and now to something approaching concern. Chester was actually doing it. The crazy old man and his ancient mule were building something that looked like it might work. How's he affording all this? Wondered Jim Morrison, stirring his coffee with more force than necessary. That much lumber, roofing materials, windows, we're talking about $50,000 easy. Maybe more, added Bob Hendricks, and he's paying cash for everything. Eddie Packer says he's never seen anything like it. Doc Williams, who'd become an unofficial defender of Chester's project, looked up from his morning paper. Maybe he's been saving money all these years instead of spending it on new trucks every 2 years. The comment stung because it was true. Most of the men in the diner had financed their way into debt for vehicles, boats, and equipment they didn't really need, while Chester had lived simply and apparently saved every penny. But the labor alone, Jim persisted. How's one old man going to wire and plumb a house that size? The answer to that question had been gradually revealing itself over the past month. Chester wasn't working entirely alone anymore. It had started with Tom Bradley, Chester's neighbor, who'd wandered over one morning to watch the progress and ended up holding boards. While Chester marked cuts, Tom was retired himself, bored with inactivity, and impressed despite himself by the quality of Chester's work. Need a hand with that beam? Tom had asked, seeing Chester struggling to position a heavy piece of framing lumber. Wouldn't say no to help, Chester had replied, and just like that, he had his first volunteer. Tom had brought coffee the next morning and stayed to help install the first row of wall studs. By the end of the week, he was showing up regularly, and word of Chester's project and the quality of his work was spreading through the informal network of retired men who were looking for ways to feel useful again. Eddie Packer had been the second recruit. As the lumber yard owner, he had both the skills and the professional interest to see the project succeed. He started dropping by after work to offer advice and gradually found himself staying to help with complex installations. "This old man knows what he's doing," Eddie told his wife over dinner. "The framing is solid as anything I've seen in 30 years. Better than most of the professional contractors in the county." Within a month, Chester had a regular crew of volunteers who showed up most mornings to work alongside him. They were all older men, all retired or semi-retired, all drawn by the combination of meaningful work and Chester's quiet competence. The transformation in Chester himself was remarkable. The solitary man who'd ridden through town every morning for decades was now the leader of a small construction crew, directing work with the confidence of someone who'd finally found his calling. "Hand me that level, Tom," Chester would call out, his voice carrying across the work site with authority. "Eddie, check that corner for square. It looks off by about a quarter inch." Bertha had adapted to the increased activity by appointing herself the official site supervisor. She wandered among the workers with the dignity of a creature who understood her own importance, occasionally offering suggestions in the form of gentle nudges or disapproving snorts. The children themselves had become part of the project in ways that surprised everyone. They still lived at the children's home, which would remain open until the new facility was ready. But the social worker had started bringing them out to see the progress. Chester had been nervous about the first visit, uncertain how children would react to his awkward attempts at conversation. "Is this really going to be our house?" asked Maria, the eldest at 15, studying the framed structure with the critical. "I have someone who'd lived in too many temporary places. If you want it to be," Chester replied, "it's being built for you." 8-year-old Danny had been more direct. "Can I help build it? I'm good with hammers." Chester had looked at the eager face and made a decision that transformed the project. "Again, sure you can help, but we'll start you with measuring and marking. Work your way up to hammers." Soon the weekend visits included the children as junior crew members, learning basic construction skills while contributing to their own future home. Chester discovered he had a natural teaching ability, patiently explaining techniques and safety rules to eager students who absorbed everything he taught them. "He's different with the kids," Tom Bradley observed to Eddie one afternoon as they watched Chester help 10-year-old Sarah learn to use a handsaw, patient in a way you don't expect from a man who's lived alone so long. "Kids bring out something in people," Eddie replied, "even people who think they don't have anything left to give." The town's attitude toward the project was evolving too. The morning ridicule at Murphy's Diner had given way to regular updates on progress, and several people had started driving by the work site on weekends to see how things were developing. "Maybe we should organize some kind of community support," suggested Martha Hendricks during a garden club meeting. "Furniture, donations, volunteer labor, that sort of thing. I hear they're going to need a playground," added Susan Morrison. And someone mentioned that Chester's planning to homeschool all 8 children. "That's going to require books, supplies, computers." The women looked at each other, recognizing the birth of a project that could engage the whole community. They'd been so focused on the impossibility of Chester's dream that they'd missed the opportunity to be part of making it real. But Chester was ahead of them there too. When the framing was complete and the roof was on, he'd ridden Bertha into town and stopped at the bank, the real estate office, and the church, leaving behind carefully written letters that explained his vision and requested specific kinds of support. He needed furniture appropriate for children of different ages. He needed educational materials for homeschooling. He needed volunteers who could help with cooking, cleaning, and childcare once the facility was operational. Most importantly, he needed the community to understand that this wasn't Chester Abernathy's crazy project anymore. It was Millbrook's chance to ensure that 8 children didn't have to be separated just because it was administratively convenient. The response surprised even Chester's growing group of supporters. By September, donations were arriving regularly. Bedroom furniture from families whose children had grown up, books from the library's annual sale, toys and games from parents who wanted to help. The Methodist Church organized a furniture refinishing project, and the local high school's shop class volunteered to build custom bookshelves and desks. "It's like the whole town caught whatever Chester had," marveled Doc Williams, watching a caravan of pickup trucks deliver donated items to the construction site. 6 months ago, they thought he was crazy. Now they're all trying to help him. Prove he was right. Chester stood on his front porch that evening, watching the sunset over the nearly completed house that would soon shelter 8 children who'd been scheduled for separation. Bertha grazed peacefully in the pasture, and the sounds of evening crickets, distant traffic, the lowing of cattle created the soundtrack for a life that had suddenly become much larger than he'd ever imagined. Tomorrow the electrical inspector would sign off on the wiring. Next week the plumbing would be completed. Within a month, 8 children would move into bedrooms they'd helped build, in a house that had become the focus of an entire community's efforts. Chester had set out to build a home for children who needed one. Instead, he'd built something much more powerful, proof that one person's impossible dream could inspire an entire town to remember what they were capable of when they worked together. The day the children moved in, half of Millbrook turned out to watch. It was a crisp October morning, perfect for the kind of beginning that deserved an audience. Chester stood on the front porch of the completed house, wearing his best shirt and a tie he'd borrowed from Tom Bradley, watching as the Department of Children's Services van pulled into the driveway, followed by a parade of cars containing neighbors who'd become invested in this moment. The house behind him was magnificent in its simple functionality. 2 stories of solid construction, painted white with green shutters, surrounded by the wraparound porch where children could play safely, while adults supervised from rocking chairs that the Methodist Church had donated. A swing set occupied one corner of the yard, installed by the high school football team as a community service project. Gardens that the Ladies' Garden Club had planted promised fresh vegetables and flowers come spring. Inside, 8 bedrooms waited for their new occupants, each one furnished with care and decorated with touches that made it clear these weren't institutional spaces but real homes. The kitchen could feed an army and had been stocked by donations from every grocery store in 3 counties. The living room contained enough books to start a small library, all organized by reading level and subject matter. But most importantly, it contained something that hadn't existed when Chester started this project 9 months ago: the attention and care of an entire community that had discovered they were capable of extraordinary things when they chose to be. Mr. Chester, Danny, now 9 years old, burst from the van and ran toward the porch with the enthusiasm of a child who'd been promised something wonderful and was finally going to receive it. "Is it really finished? Can we really live here?" Chester knelt down to Danny's level, his face creasing into a smile that had become more frequent over the past few months. "It's really finished, son, and it's really yours." The other children emerged more cautiously, their experiences having taught them to be careful about believing in good things that might be taken away. But as they explored their new home, guided by Chester and the volunteers who'd helped build it, their reserve melted into excitement. "This is my room." 15-year-old Maria stood in the doorway of a space that had been designed specifically for a teenager who needed privacy and independence. It contained a desk for studying, shelves for personal belongings, and windows that looked out over the fields where Bertha grazed peacefully. "All yours," Chester confirmed. "You can decorate it however you want." Maria's eyes filled with tears she quickly wiped away. At 15, she'd learned not to hope for things like rooms of her own, but here it was anyway, real and permanent and hers. The community celebration that followed was the largest gathering Millbrook had seen since the county fair. Tables of food appeared in the backyard, set up by church groups and neighbor volunteers. A bluegrass band that included Eddie Packer on fiddle provided entertainment. Children from town played with the new residents, creating the kind of natural integration that adults often struggled to achieve. "You did something amazing here, Chester," said Bob Hendricks, the mayor who'd spent months making jokes about the old man and his mule. "I owe you an apology. We all do." Chester accepted the offered handshake with the grace of someone who'd never expected recognition, but appreciated it nonetheless. "No apology needed, Bob. Just glad it worked out." Worked out? Bob looked around at the celebration, at the house that had exceeded everyone's expectations, at the 8 children who were finally home. "Chester, you didn't just build a house. You built something that made this whole town better." It was true. The project had revealed capacities for cooperation and generosity that many residents hadn't known they possessed. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other had worked side by side on construction tasks. Businesses had competed to see who could contribute the most useful donations. The high school had started a mentoring program to help the new residents with their studies. Even more importantly, Chester's example had inspired other acts of community service. The Methodist Church had started a food pantry. The library had expanded its after-school programs. The town council had approved funding for a community center that would serve not just Millbrook, but the entire county. "What's next for you?" asked Doc Williams, finding Chester sitting on the porch steps with Bertha nearby, both of them watching the festivities with the satisfaction of a job well done. Chester thought about the question for the first time in decades. He wasn't entirely sure what came next. The house was built, the children were settled, the community was engaged. His original goal had been accomplished more completely than he'd ever dared hope. "Well," he said slowly, "those kids are going to need education. I figure I'll start by teaching them basic construction skills. Then we'll move on to other practical subjects. And there's always maintenance work on a place this size. You're going to stay here. Help raise them." Chester looked through the window at the children who were exploring their new home with wonder and delight. At 9 months, this had been his project. Now it was his life, and he couldn't imagine it any other way. "Seems like they might need someone around who knows how things work. Besides, Bertha's gotten used to having kids around. She'd be disappointed if we left now." As if summoned by her name, Bertha wandered over and nuzzled Chester's shoulder with the affection of a creature who'd been part of something important and knew it. That evening, after the last of the visitors had gone home and the children had been settled into their new bedrooms, Chester sat on the front porch with Tom Bradley and Eddie Packer, watching stars appear over the Tennessee hills. "You know what the funny thing is," Tom said, breaking a comfortable silence, "when you started this, we all thought you were crazy." "Maybe I was," Chester replied. "But sometimes crazy is just another word for seeing something nobody else can see yet." "What do you see now?" Eddie asked. Chester gestured toward the house behind them, where 8 children were sleeping safely in beds they could call their own, in rooms that belonged to them, in a home that had been built by an entire community working together. "I see proof that there's no such thing as impossible if you're willing to start with what you have and work with what you can find." 1 year later, the Abernathy Children's Home, as it had officially been named by the county, was being featured in state newspapers as a model for community-based childcare. The 8 original residents were thriving academically and socially, and 3 more children had been placed there. Through the state system, Chester had become a certified foster parent and had completed his teaching certification through an accelerated program designed for people with practical skills. The house had been expanded to include a workshop where older children learned carpentry, mechanics, and other trades alongside their traditional academic subjects. But the most significant change was in Millbrook itself, the town that had once defined itself by what it wasn't, not backward, not old-fashioned, not stuck in the past, now took pride in what it had become, a community that took care of its own and welcomed children who needed homes. "The kids want to know if you'll teach them to ride," Tom Bradley mentioned one afternoon. Watching Chester work with Bertha in the pasture, Chester looked toward the house, where several children were doing homework on the front porch while others worked in the garden. "Bertha's getting old for carrying riders. They don't want to ride her. They want their own mules." Chester paused in his work, considering this development. That would require more land, more buildings, more everything. "The Jameson place next door is going up for sale," Eddie mentioned casually. 40 more acres, with a good barn already on it. Chester looked at his two friends, recognizing the gleam in their eyes that meant they were already planning the next impossible project. I suppose, he said slowly, we could look into it that evening. Chester sat on his porch with 8 children and 2 volunteers, watching Bertha graze in the last light of day, and realized that what had started as one old man's crazy idea had become something much more powerful, a way of life that proved families could be built anywhere people were willing to care for each other. The town had stopped laughing at Chester Abernathy and his mule long ago. Now they were following his example, one impossible dream at a time.